If you've got a Bible, I'm going to ask you to join with me in turning to 1 Timothy chapter 6. 1 Timothy chapter 6. So we've been in this series called The Generous Life. We've been looking at what the Bible says about how we handle our money, our finances. And over the last couple of weeks, we've taken time to unpack three, I think, significant themes and how the Bible gives us guidance. The idea of giving generously, the idea of saving wisely, and today the idea of living appropriately. And as I've said over the last couple of weeks, the reality for a lot of people is this. When you look at those three bullets, when you look at those three ideas, for many of us, in essence, we live life from the bottom up. That is, we as money comes in, we've got things we want to spend, we've got bills to cover, things to pay, our standard of living to maintain, and even if our income goes up over time, often it's the case that maybe we just allow our expenses to expand with that, so that we're not always saving like we should or really giving as the Bible describes. And so if in reality you live from the bottom up, my challenge over the last couple of weeks has simply been this, to flip the script. And I've asked you to think, what if you started from the top and worked down? What would that look like? What does that look like in your life? And for some of us, what might need to change? Now, obviously, as we talked over the last couple of weeks, there's still questions about, how do I just approach handling money in everyday situations? What about my standard of living, not only paying the bills, but how I enjoy life, what I spend money on? What about those kinds of issues? And as we think about those questions, what I want to do this morning is just look briefly again at what I think is one of the most significant passages in the Bible to give us guidance on these kinds of questions, and that's 1 Timothy chapter 6. And as we come to this text, let me just give you a little bit of background, because Paul the apostle is writing one of his associates, Timothy, and I think what is apparent is that as Timothy is carrying out his ministry in Ephesus, there are certain false teachers that are now influencing the church. And among other things, what Paul is doing in this letter is he is advising Timothy as to how to respond to the situation. We don't know all the details about this false teaching. There's actually a lot of debate on what that could entail. However, it is clear, at least in one way, that it seems that some of these false teachers are in essence saying that their spirituality should lead to financial gain. He states that in 1 Timothy 6 in kind of describing these people. So in response to this kind of situation, Paul gives guidance to Timothy on how to instruct people concerning finances. And I think he gives us a framework to kind of approach our lifestyle well. And to show you that, let's just look at two paragraphs from this chapter. First, 1 Timothy 6 through 10, Paul writes, right? He's already said, look, these people think godliness is always going to lead to financial gain. He said, no. But godliness with contentment is actually great gain. For we brought nothing into the world and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. Those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap, into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Some people eager for money have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. Then he continues a little later in the passage on the same topic. Now he's speaking kind of specifically to those who have resources. Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. Now, as you read this, notice just a couple of things. First of all, and we've already seen this, but I want to keep coming back to this because I think this is truly important. First of all, notice that as Paul talks about money, the way I like to think of it is he gets below the surface to talk about matters of the heart. Did you notice in this section, he talks about like the love of money. He talks about desires. He talks about the sources of our hope. In other words, he's talking about attitudes, commitments, and issues of motivation. Often in our discussions of money, right, when you're thinking about money, when you're working on how to handle your money, our focus is on numbers and percentages, right? We ask questions like, okay, what should I be giving? Or how much should I be saving? Can I afford that car payment? You know, how can I pay off this debt? And we ask those questions, and hear me clearly. In handling money, you need to ask those types of questions. But again and again, notice what Paul is doing. He's getting below the surface. He's challenging us to look deeper than that. Deeper than the bottom line, deeper than the Excel spreadsheet. He's really challenging us to see, okay, so what's going on in your heart? In writing about this topic, author Tim Keller notes, if we look carefully at how we handle money, at times we will see the way what he describes as certain deep idols may be at work in our lives. These include power, approval, comfort, and security. Keller notes that each of these idols creates its own set of hopes and fears. For instance, maybe I'm in really good shape financially. I'm giving, I'm saving, you know, my checking account, my resources, they're pristine. But maybe underlying that is a deep need for control. And with that, my sense of hope, my sense of security is really related to my finances. It's related to how my 401k is doing as I move through life. And likewise, even though I'm doing well, maybe there are certain nagging fears. What if I'm not saving enough? What if the unexpected happens? What am I going to do when the next downturn in the market hits? So what I want you to see here is as important as it is to ask those questions about numbers and percentages, Paul really is challenging us to look below the waterline, look below the numbers. And what he's really saying is, okay, so as you handle money, what's going on in your heart? And as he does that, notice something else in this section. I think he gives us a simple idea that to really guide our approach to money. And that's the statement that he makes in verse 6, right? He says, godliness with contentment is great gain. And that's kind of the framework that he gives us. And again, remember, he's dealing with a situation where certain teachers have simply viewed the issue of faith as a means to financial gain. And now he is saying, no. Let me show you a different approach. So just think about that phrase, godliness with contentment, or godliness plus contentment is great gain. So let's just unpack that by thinking about the different terms Paul uses here. First of all, this term godliness. Now I realize that's probably not a term you use on a regular basis. I mean, it really does sound like we would call it a church word, wouldn't we? Godliness. And it can't even sound pretentious or condescending, right? How godly are you? If I ask you, do you feel godly today? Most of us would probably say no. But here's the deal. The term Paul is using here and the way he uses it really simply means this. When he's talking about godliness, he's simply talking about putting truth into action. Putting what you believe into practice. So as he has talked and he has trained and he's taught in different settings, he's kind of given the biblical perspective on giving and saving and living. What he's saying, look, is I want you to put this into action. Even as we've talked in the last couple of weeks, maybe there's been an action step that you've taken away with, and as you kind of seek to put into practice what we've been talking about, that's an exercise in godliness. And so he says godliness, but then he says this needs to be partnered with contentment. And simply put, contentment is really, I think, the freedom from the relentless pursuit of more. It's freedom from perhaps an ongoing dissatisfaction with what I have because I could have more and I don't. We'll talk more about this next week. So Paul says, look, godliness plus contentment is truly great gain. He's like, look, I know all these other people seem to be driven by money. They're even using kind of Christianity or their understanding of Christianity to try and seek financial gain, but that's not where it's at. Paul says instead, what I want you to do is I want you to put into practice what we've been talking about in terms of handling your money, and I want you to couple that with the freedom from the relentless pursuit of more because of your faith and trust in God as our ultimate provider. And he says, and what this will do, this brings you into a particular way of life. And of course, right at the end of this passage, he says, you know what? This is the life that is truly life. That's not a guarantee in any way of great financial success. But what it is this. It is a promise of living in the flow of God's grace. And that's what we've seen throughout this series as we looked at the writings of Paul and other passages, like right, the invitation. I want you to live in the flow of God's grace. I want you to see that through the work of Christ, God's grace is now at work in your life. And I want you just to be a recipient of the resources he puts in your life. And even as you enjoy life, as you save, you're also to be giving, and you're to be an ongoing agent of grace so that as you give, as you participate in what he is doing, that ultimately leads to thanksgiving to God, and the cycle continues. He says, this is the life that is truly life. And I think in helping us embrace this idea, to really live out this guideline, Paul also gives us guardrails. He shows us, here's the path, right? It's godliness with contentment. This is the way this is how I want you to live in the cycle of God's grace. But underlying what he's saying here is also the recognition that we can drift off the path. And let me just highlight what I think are two guardrails that are implied in Paul's writings here. First, there is the guardrail against asceticism. Right? And now when we think about asceticism, different ways to describe that, but an ascetic practices self-denial, depriving oneself of all but the essential basics of the material world. And I think when it comes to money, the idea can be that, well, the less you spend, the more spiritual you are. To the point that for some, having more money or financial resources is viewed as being deficient as a Christian. Maybe you were brought up in an environment that kind of emphasized frugality to the point where you feel guilty about spending money. Maybe you have certain negative emotions associated with money and spending. For instance, we never grew up celebrating life events like birthdays or graduations. You just didn't do that. Likewise, if this is kind of my approach to life, maybe I've developed a condescending attitude towards others because they spend more than I do. I can't believe they spent that much on that car, or that kind of thing. But I actually think Paul puts up a guardrail against this. Interestingly, Paul has already critiqued dimensions of ascetic behavior earlier in this book, particularly in chapter 4. And notice also a couple of things in this passage. Again, Paul doesn't say it's the possession of money that's a root of all evil. What does he say? It's the love of money that's the root of all evil. Or excuse me, that is a root of all evil. And here's the deal, you don't have to have it to love it, right? Later, when he is addressing specifically those who have more resources, he doesn't tell them, don't be rich. He says, don't be arrogant. Right? Don't put your hope in what you own. So again, he's dealing with heart issues. Furthermore, he says, look, God gives us gifts to enjoy. And I want you to enjoy that. Don't feel guilty every time you spend money. So one guardrail that he puts up is this kind of view that, well, the more you spend, the more deficient spiritually you must be, and you can't enjoy what God gives you. You've got to avoid that at all costs. So he puts up a guardrail against asceticism. But I think also, and perhaps this is more prominent in this text, he puts up a guardrail against materialism. Right? The lifestyle where my life is centered, it's really driven by a pursuit of really money and what it can buy. And underlying that is, in some sense, the belief that this really can bring me happiness and well-being. And in setting up this guardrail, notice a couple of things that Paul says. First, he says, look, don't you know you can't take it with you? Don't you realize everything you own of value, everything you accumulate will either wear out or one day it will be owned by somebody else? So Paul is highlighting the temporary nature of our stuff. And I think by implication, he is also saying this. He's saying, look, if your life is focused on the stuff that doesn't matter, you're missing out on the stuff that does. So don't let this stuff be the focus of your life. Don't be someone who is affluent materially, but impoverished relationally and spiritually. Don't let it be the ultimate pursuit of your heart. Instead, he says, focus on what really matters. So he says, look, know that you can't take this with you. Another thing he says here, he notes this pattern can be destructive. Right? He describes a downward spiral of the way unhealthy desires can be at work in us. And he says this you can get caught in a trap with this, which continues to fuel foolish and harmful desires. And so he highlights the negative consequences of this. This week, interestingly, as I was doing some reading, I discovered a work by a consumer researcher. This professor's field of study is really how kind of buying stuff affects us and all that entails. She talks a lot about how we spend and purchase things and the impact that can have. And she's discovered, and this was just fascinating, not surprising, but she discovered in her research that people who are really driven by stuff, right, that there's just this great sense that, when I buy certain things, it feels an emotional need, and it kind of gives me a great sense of purpose and excitement. When I'm driven by the purchase of stuff, she said, there really is a great deal of emotional pleasure that comes in the anticipation and the purchase of it. But she says over time, there's then this terrific decline in the emotional satisfaction that comes with the stuff we bring. Interestingly, the title of her article is When Wanting is Better Than Having. And I read parts of it. To be honest with you, parts of it I didn't understand. And I'm like, I think the Apostle Paul says something very similar to this. Right? That we can get trapped in this unhealthy cycle of if I just had the right stuff, and we get excited about the stuff, and then I buy the new thing, and for a season, that is so exciting, but kind of the newness wears off, or the excitement wears off, and then I got to buy something else, and the cycle continues, driven by those unhealthy desires. And Paul says, you know what? I don't want you to get trapped in that cycle. I think one of the reasons he's so intentional in his warning is this. When you think about it, in some areas of your life, when you get off track, you know it right away, right? If you are stealing, you know it. If you just cheated on your income tax, you know it. You knew it when you did it. But when it comes to greed and materialism, we're not always attuned to the fact that we have drifted there. And this is why Paul says, look, this can become a trap in your life. You can get caught in this endless cycle of really putting your hopes and dreams in the stuff and the possessions that you have. And you're just lured away. With that in mind, let me just kind of quickly give you several diagnostic questions just to help you stay alert. So here are 4 questions. First, do I have recurring if only thoughts about money and possessions, right? If only I could afford, if only I had. Secondly, is my sense of self-worth tied to what I earn or what I own? Is that really important to me and how I view myself? Third, how do I comfort myself when life turns against me? Is it always about spending? And fourth, is my financial status a source of pride and arrogance? So here's what Paul's saying. He's saying, look, there are other ways to do this. And again, he's particularly critical of these false teachers. He's saying, well, you buy into this, you're going to be rich, and that's what you really need. He said, no, there's a different way to live. I want you to embrace what I've been teaching, Paul says. And I want you to put it into action. And as you do that, I want you to be liberated from the endless pursuit of simply having more. And together, these themes will provide guardrails against kind of going off the path and just, not being willing to spend or not being willing to enjoy what God has given you, but also going off the path of materialism and just presuming that life is about the stuff that you get. And, if you just die with the most toys, you win. He's saying, no, I want something else for you. I want you to experience the life that is truly life. And what that means is in how you handle your money, I want you to live in the flow of God's grace as people who are being transformed by the good news of Jesus Christ. Now, as you think about this, let me just kind of quickly share two observations by different authors that in an ongoing way I find challenging, encouraging, helpful, at times deeply convicting. So we think about kind of lifestyle. 2 observations. The first comes from C.S. Lewis. In his book, Mere Christianity, he's talking about kind of this issue of lifestyle, and he's talking about the issue of giving. And he makes this interesting comment. He basically says, look, I can't tell you. He says, I can't tell you how much to give. I'm not going to go there. But then he says this. He says, however, if your life looks exactly like the lives of other people in your same income bracket who aren't Christians, then you're probably not giving enough away. I thought, that's good. And so let me just tell you kind of what this over the years has looked like for Rose and me. I think for us, just intuitively, what we have tried to do is just kind of in an ongoing way realize there's certain purchases we're going to make, certain ways we're going to spend money, and we want to be intentional in not getting the best, not stretching the budget, not getting what we could afford to do, but we don't always have to have the newest or the best. And so we've tried to be, in some areas of our lives, really intentional in putting this into practice. And I realize some of you are saying, oh, George, I know one place you don't spend money. You don't spend money on your wardrobe. And you would be right. These shoes, $29.99 at Costco. Woo! I think I just became a social influencer there. But anyway, no, and it's part of the reason our cars are older. Now hear me clearly. I don't want to get into this game of my car's older than your car, therefore I'm more spiritual. I don't want to do that. And trust me, I do spend money, and there are ways in which we deeply enjoy the resources that God has put in our lives. The point is not, it's not kind of some heavy-handed legalism. The point is, I don't want to get caught in the trap that Paul describes here. I don't want to get lured into, well, if only I'm always buying the nicest stuff and pushing the limits, if only I do that, I'm going to feel better about my life, I'm going to be more fulfilled, and that's where true me. I just don't want to get caught in that. I want to experience the life that is truly life. So that quote by C.S. Lewis. The second quote comes from an author by the name of Ralph Winter. And in writing on this, Ralph Winter has said, let's think back to the Second World War. And he talks about the fact during the Second World War, if you were alive during the Second World War in England or in America, just the way people spent money and the way resources were used, it was all done with kind of an understanding we're at war, and there was just a wartime mentality. When I think about that, I think about the neighborhood where Rose and I lived for 2 years in England when we were in Cambridge, and there were certain places down the street you could see where the metal railings had been pulled out during the Second World War so that the metals could be melted down and repurposed. And Winter says, look, what would it look like? What would it look like for us as Christians to have a wartime mentality in how we handle our resources? And by that he means this: what if it's not just, hey, I got it all, I'm going to spend it all and do whatever I want, but I just have this deeper sense of purpose and meaning and direction in how I handle my resources, because I'm part of what God is doing through what Jesus describes as the kingdom of God. And again, in different ways, these two authors are getting back to, what does it look like for you to live in the ongoing flow of God's grace as you handle money? Now, in wrapping this up this morning, here's what I want to do. Can I just ask you, kind of in the quietness of this moment, just to kind of close your eyes and bow your heads with me for a moment. And I want you to do this thought experiment. And the thought experiment is this. Obviously, over the last 3 weeks, we've been talking about giving, we've been talking about saving, living, and how we handle our money. And as we've been talking about that, I want you to imagine a scenario. Think of someone in your life whom you deeply respect. Maybe it's someone here at church, someone in your Live, Love, Lead group, someone you volunteer with or serve with, someone that you would say, I deeply respect this individual as a follower of Christ, and I deeply respect and value this friendship because they really desire God's best for me. So just think about who that might be. And then imagine this. Imagine this person having total access to look at your finances. What's coming in, what's going out, where it's being stored, all of that. Just imagine this person kind of sitting down with all of that information. And then having an honest conversation with you. And my question is, what might that conversation look like? What might it entail? What would they really kind of encourage you in? What would they cheer you on in? And where might they say, are you sure you really want to be doing this long term? Where might they challenge you? And with that in mind, my question is there really a next step you need to take in handling your resources as you seek to live in the flow of God's grace? Let's pray together. Father, as we've been talking about how we handle money, I pray that we wouldn't lose sight of the way the Bible continually drills down to matters of the heart. As we think about giving, as we think about saving, as we think about lifestyle, the Bible is constantly helping us see that in the course of how we shape our finances, it reveals something about our heart, and the habits we develop then continue to shape our hearts. So I pray we might be attuned to next steps that maybe some of us need to take in how we are handling our resources. And I pray we wouldn't see that as weighty or heavy, but I pray that we would see it as moving into this way of life, which Paul says is the life that is truly life. I thank you for the way your grace is at work in our lives. And I pray we would understand how that grace is to be at work in us and to flow through us, even in areas like our finances. And I pray that in Jesus' name. Amen. As you think about those things, if there are ways in which we can pray with you, we're going to have members of our prayer team here. And as you go, I would just challenge you, if there's a next step you need to take, be willing to take it. And now as you go, can we leave this place this morning as people who in all areas of our lives, including our finances, seek to embrace the life that is truly life. Amen.